Which way is true, Christianity or Islam? The ways offered by Christianity and Islam are mutually exclusive and should never be equivocated. An interesting part of church history includes the original name of the movement Jesus started. In his ministry, Jesus preached the gospel and the kingdom and commanded his followers to do the same all over the world. Jesus also declared he was establishing his church. As the movement spread, the people outside of the fellowship of believers started calling these followers of Christ what they thought was a derogatory name, Christians, which means Christ-like. That name eventually stuck, but the early followers actually called themselves by a different term, the Way. Their chosen name seems to have been used mostly in the early years and in the geographic area known as the cradle of Christianity, the Levant. 6 or 7 centuries later, in the same area of the Levant, a movement spread among former Arab followers of Judaism and Christianity. These people seem to have an anti-Trinitarian version of Christianity. The scant historical and archaeological evidence points to a later creation of a book in the 7th to 9th centuries called the Quran, a people called Muslim, and a new Arab religion called Islam. One interesting connection between Christianity and Islam is that both emphasize the spiritual concept epitomizing their belief, that it is the way. I will briefly highlight the origin of the Christian idea of the way, show how Islam also emphasizes a way, and emphasize the character of who we follow determines the validity of following the true way. Ultimately, only one can be true because the tenets of their belief systems are mutually exclusive. The origin of the Christian idea of the way. Before the followers of Jesus were first called Christians, they called their movement the Way. This term is mentioned several times in the book of Acts in connection with the early followers of Christ. Saul of Tarsus went to Damascus to take prisoners from the men and women who belonged to the Way. After Saul was converted, he became a missionary and went by the name of Paul. In Ephesus, Paul met some of the synagogue who became obstinate. They refused to believe and publicly maligned the Way. During his trial before Felix, Paul said, "I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the Way," which they call a sect. Acts narrates Felix knew about the Way. It seems that the Romans considered the Way to be a sect of Judaism rather than a separate religion. Luke says that Aquila and Priscilla explained to Apollos the way of God more fully. Even Jesus' enemies strangely referred to Jesus as teaching the way. You teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Peter refers to Christianity as the way of truth. And the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus' broken body is the new and living way for us to enter the most holy place. It's likely that the early followers of Christ referred to themselves as followers of the way because Jesus' statement in John chapter 14, that he is the way, the truth, and the life. Islam also emphasizes a way. We may follow others as they follow Christ, but if they fail, we still look to the God-man Jesus as our way. But Islam claims to have Muhammad, a fallen man, as their way, or sunnah, or example. The key emphasis of Islam is the idea that Islam alone is the way, or the path, repeated over and again in the Quran and the Hadith. The very word Sharia means the way. As shown in the introduction, it is not a coincidence that Christianity was called the way. In the areas first it spread, and these are the areas that Islam invaded and usurped 600 years later, the area known as Levant, or what Arabs call Shem. This includes Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Sinai, and the western part of Iraq. The fact Islam adopted this Christian concept of the way is further evidence Islam is merely an anti-Trinitarian heresy. The Islamic concept of sunnah is about following Muhammad as the supreme example, seeking to imitate what is said about him in the Quran, Hadith, and Sirah. Though none of the writings of the Islamic trilogy state directly that Muhammad was a perfect man, the Muslim scholars almost unanimously claim that he was the perfect man. Islamic Sharia is based on the Quran and religious scholars' interpretations. Scholars make Sharia rulings called fatwas. The Quran demands 89 times for Muslims to follow Muhammad's way or example or sunnah. Additionally, Muslims are to follow previous prophets or messengers who came before Muhammad, or they will be damned. There are only 5 direct commands to follow Muhammad in the section of the Quran which is attributed to the time when he was in Mecca. But there are 84 direct commands to follow Muhammad in the section of the Quran which is attributed to the time when he was in Medina. The implication of this is that when people refused to follow Muhammad while he was in Mecca, when he was trying to persuade them to follow his spiritual path, his way, he gained only a handful of followers. But when he fled to Medina and began using political and violent methods to force people to follow his way, he began gaining many followers. This shows that from the beginning, Islam has used violence to gain success because it fails to persuade people to follow based on its spiritual tenets. The character of who we follow determines the validity for following that way. I want to look a little bit at Muhammad's character. Muhammad was a 7th century caravan trader who became demon-possessed. Even Muhammad himself thought he was possessed by a demon when the spirit Jibreel first came to him and on several other occasions. Let's look at a few examples. In Sirah chapter 9, these verses also appear in Quran 96 and are considered the first recitation of Muhammad. In the cave of Hira, the angel came to him and in it asked him to recite. The prophet replied, "I don't know how to recite." And then the spirit pressed him so hard that he almost couldn't take it. And then it released him and said, "Recite." 3 different times he told him to do that. And 3 different times Muhammad said, "I don't know how to recite." On the 3rd time, it pressed me and then released me and said, "Recite in the name of your Lord, who has created all that exists, has created man from a clot. Recite, and your Lord is most generous, up to that which he knew not." Now his wife Khadijah gave Muhammad a test to try to reassure Muhammad. When Muhammad was distraught after he received the first recitation in the Hira cave, he ran to Khadijah's tent. The muscles between his neck and shoulders were trembling till he came upon Khadijah and said, "Cover me, cover me." "Oh, Khadijah, what is wrong with me? I was afraid that something bad might happen to me." Then he told her the story. Khadijah said, "Nay, but receive the good tidings. By Allah, Allah will never disgrace you." After some time, to reassure Muhammad, Khadijah decided to test Jibreel. Khadijah said to the Apostle Allah, "Oh cousin, are you able to tell me about your visitant when he comes to you?" And he says, "Yes." And so then 3 times he says, "Now he's entered the room." And he said, she said, "Now get on my right thigh." And then she asked him, "Have you seen him?" And he said, "Yes." And then he said, "Get on my left one. Have you seen him?" "Yes." And then she said, "Get in my lap." And he went there and he said, "Have you seen him?" And he said, "Yes." And then she opened showed her form or her private parts and cast aside her veil while the apostle was sitting on her lap. Then she said, "Can you see him?" And he replied, "No." She said, "O son of my uncle, rejoice and be of good heart. By Allah, he is an angel and not a Satan." So you see, her pagan way of thinking, she thought if she exposed her private parts, that if it was an angel, it would be demure and run away. And so that was how she convinced Muhammad that it was not a demon, but an angel. In a third example, the hadith writer Bukhari reports that Muhammad attempted suicide on multiple occasions because he believed he was possessed by an evil spirit. The Prophet said, "After Jibreel departed from me, he thought none of God's creatures was more hateful to me than an ecstatic poet or a man possessed. I could not even look at them. I thought, woe is me, poet or possessed. I will go to the top of the mountain and throw myself down, that I may kill myself and gain rest. But midway on the mountain, I heard a voice from heaven saying, O Muhammad, thou art the apostle of Allah, and I am Jibreel." And so each time Muhammad tried to kill himself, Jibreel would come to him and convince him that he was the apostle of Allah. Other Muslim sources which give accounts of Muhammad's desire to commit suicide are listed here. In the Seerah, Muhammad said, "I fear lest I should become a magician, lest one should proclaim me a follower of the jinn, that is the evil spirits. And again, I fear lest there should be madness or demonic possession in me." After a session of shivering and shutting his eyes, there used to come over him what resembled a swoon. His face would foam, and he would roar like a young camel. And this is the same thing that would happen many times when he would receive a recitation from Jibreel. Other sources recount the problems Muhammad had with demons, suicide, witchcraft, and delusions. Here they are listed. We don't have time to cover them all. Now, I did a Google search, and I typed in, "Show me an AI image of Muhammad and Jibreel," and this is what came up, and it kind of blew me away. There's the picture that the AI drew of Muhammad, and he's holding some paper like maybe a recitation, and then there's Jibreel floating in the air, an evil spirit. Very freaky, and it made me shudder. Muhammad is not a good sunnah or example or way. Muhammad manipulated his followers by manufacturing recitations to get his way. He became a warlord who personally murdered many people who refused to follow him, including 800 Jewish men and boys in Medina. He and his thugs raided caravans, settlements, and towns, and murdered all the men and made sex slaves of the women. Muhammad was a slave trader who refused to manumit any of his slaves or any other people's slaves. He married his favorite wife Aisha at the age of 6 and consummated the marriage at the age of 9. He had sex with all of his 11 wives each day after prayer. His wives complained when he would not stop having sex with his slave girls, though they kept urging him to do so. Furthermore, Muhammad was extremely unsure of whether he or any Muslim would make it to Allah's heaven. The Quran identifies Muhammad as a sinner, and Muhammad regarded himself as a sinner. The Quran states 3 times that he asked Allah to forgive his sins. So this quick biographical summary comes from the Islamic trilogy writings themselves. Other unseemly stories about Muhammad exist. Simply put, Muhammad is not a good spiritual way or example or sunnah to follow. The character of who we follow determines the validity of following that way. In Christianity, through Jesus, we have a pure and holy example to follow. Following Christ is literally seeking to imitate God as he walked on the earth. Furthermore, Jesus continually emphasizes that he was living his life to fulfill the will of the Father in heaven. Jesus alone is the one who introduces the believer to God as Father and the believer as a child of the Godhead. The wonderful promises Yahweh provides to the Christian find a culmination at the end of Romans chapter 8. And it says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes." And it finishes by saying, "Nothing in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Some have called this passage in Romans 8 the high point of the Bible. These ideas of intimacy with Yahweh are utterly foreign to the Islamic version of theology, where Allah is far removed from creation and cares not about man. Allah is fatalistic and causes both good and evil. Furthermore, Allah gives little hope of man making it into paradise. Muslims believe that Allah's moral character is ultimately unknowable, and Allah's ways are beyond all understanding. The Quran continually shows that Allah leads astray whom He wills and guides whom He wills. One result of this is that even practicing Muslims lack assurance of Allah's forgiveness because they are not certain about Allah's ultimate will toward them. This causes an overarching Muslim fatalism that we see even in their everyday life and even in all their writings. Muslims continue to use the Arabic phrase, inshallah, meaning if God wills. Muslims use this phrase in multitudes of circumstances, often meaning whatever happens is God's will, both good and evil. Allah's will is tyrannical, not loving and nurturing. Muslims must bow to Allah's capricious will like a slave. They can never address Allah as a loving father. That would be shirk. That's blasphemy, the worst kind of sin according to Islam. The contrast between Christianity and Islam is glaring. Muslims are merely slaves of Allah, while Christians are sons of God. Jesus, John, and Paul emphasized following throughout their ministries. Jesus said, "Take up my cross and follow me." John shows Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following. Paul said, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." The character of who we follow determines the spiritual, earthly, and eternal validity for following. Muhammad and Allah do not provide a way worthy of following. Jesus, the Son of Yahweh, is worthy of following. Not only because of the character he lived out during his time on earth, but because he himself said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Jesus does not merely show believers a way, but he personifies the way. Without him, there is no way. Jesus alone is Jacob's ladder to heaven. Jesus alone is the highway of holiness. So in conclusion, we see that both Christianity and Islam give us a way, but only in Jesus do we have the true way. In Islam, we have a spurious way through Muhammad and Allah, and they can never match up to what Christianity offers.